Hello, legions of fans. I'm Travis.
And I'm David.
And we're the Game Detectives.
Now, we've been covering a lot of games from our childhoods, such as Nintendo 64 and GameCube games, but you can't just live in the past all the time. With Steam, independent games have been on the rise, so we thought we'd take a look at one of them.
And with the rise of indie games, we see a lot of deviations from the standards of what a traditional video game might look like. Games like Thomas Was Alone, Darkest Dungeon, and Volume all deviate from the original models, but at least have a method of interaction similar to what we would see in other video games. These are all games that depend on you controlling the game to move forward. But what happens when a game doesn't require input or interaction? Is it even a game anymore?
That's just one of the many questions we can ask about the game The Beginner's Guide, which was released in 2015. It was produced by Everything Unlimited Limited, a company that game maker Davey Wreden uses as a development banner for all of his past and future games. Wreden also made the successful The Stanley Parable, released in 2013. Both of the games have a very distinctive style, focusing more on narration as opposed to traditional action.
And that could make it really tricky to categorize the game. The four most popular tags for it on the Steam store are story-rich, walking simulator, indie, and atmospheric, which basically tells you that you walk in it? What does that even mean? Why play it then? Why not just make it a movie?
I'm going to argue that The Beginner's Guide works well specifically because of these simple mechanics, and it also makes a compelling story.
And I'm going to say that The Beginner's Guide doesn't really need to be a game because of its complete lack of environmental feedback or player input.
Welcome to our first Game Detectives debates. Oh yeah, and the whole thing is gonna be full of spoilers.
So if you're into deep, hippie nerd games and haven't played The Beginner's Guide yet, don't listen anymore.
But if you don't really care about spoilers, or you absolutely love hippie nerd games and have already played The Beginner's Guide, listen on. Since the main draw to the game is its complete storyline, and the plot relies heavily on some twists, it's best to play the game without knowing the details of it first. Again, that can be a little hard to figure out. The basic premise is this. Davey Wreden has a friend named Coda, who is also a game developer. Wreden really loves Coda's games and wants to share them with other people, so he made The Beginner's Guide, which consists of 17 games that Coda has made. Specifically, Wreden shares these games because suddenly Coda decided to stop making games, and he wants to build up public support for his friend so he'll go back to making games. Wreden finds a very close connection with these games, and he believes that if we experience Coda's games as well, we can get an insight into Coda's brain as to why he stopped making these games.
At least, that's what he says. But as you near the end of the game, you realize that Coda didn't really want Wreden to share any of his games with people. And Coda believes Wreden's obsession with these games is extremely unhealthy. In The Tower, Coda's last game that he made for Wreden, he reveals that Davey makes him physically ill and feels that he's been ruining his games by sharing them with others. Then Wreden reveals his true motives. He shared many of Coda's games in order to reach out to him, to say he's sorry because Coda won't respond to any more of his personal messages.
So, while we originally thought that Davey Wreden was just sharing these games because he really liked them, it turns out that he's basically obsessed with Coda and all of his games.
So after we both played through this game, we talked about whether or not this is actually real life. Are these actual games that this Coda developed, or is this all a fictional tale? Is Coda real? But all of these questions don't really have any answers. Wreden hasn't said anything about the game.
For me, those questions are part of what makes the game so good. Since I had already played The Stanley Parable, which also had a really untrustworthy narrator, I instantly had my suspicions about this game as well. I just kind of assumed that there was something going on simply more than just sharing Coda's games, and I thought that the game actually wasn't something that happened in real life, as we're led to believe.
When I first started the game, I just thought there was this guy who was sharing his friends' games because he thought they were cool. And when he was sharing his thoughts about the games, he sounded like a really pretentious guy. When Wreden would analyze the games to try and decipher Coda's thoughts, he came across as a really smug character, which made me dislike the game at first.
That's why the beginning of the game worked really well for me. At face value, Davey's narrator is a pretentious guy, but I suspected that the narrator was made to be pretentious, not that Wreden himself was. and Wreden played that character very well. So when the twist comes at the end, and the narrator is actually this guy who's obsessed with Coda and can't find meaning in his own life, it made sense to me, because I always thought there was something strange with his personality.
But still, even when I play through the game the second time, I feel like Davey's narrator is an off-putting character. He's the ultimate hipster gamer stereotype trying to find meaning in everything, and it's not the kind of guy I would want to spend time with.
But at the same time, his character is intriguing. As Wreden takes you through all these games, you start to question his motives. Even though he claims to want to, quote, talk about Coda's games for what they are rather than what they're not, Wreden alters some of these games so they fit what he thinks the game means. In a game called Whisper, Coda includes a maze, but Wreden thinks it's pointless, so he just takes you to the end of the maze. One game traps you in a jail for an hour, but Wreden opens the jail for you right away. One game slows your ascent up a flight of stairs, but Wreden lets you press enter to regain normal walking speed. He's altering these games as you go along, even though he claims to love them for exactly what they are.
But some of these game sections are so boring that I never really had any motivation to do them, especially the second time around. A lot of them only last for a couple minutes, some even under 60 seconds, and there's no interaction, because most of what you do is walk around while Davey narrates. There are some points where you can use dialogue and you can activate certain objects, but there is just not enough interaction to really get excited about these games. Two of them only last for a couple of seconds, where you walk down a road and find signs that say, now entering and now leaving. How deep, right?
But I would argue that the games themselves aren't made to be these awesome interactive adventure games. They're meant to be small, simple games, so I don't think you really need that level of interaction necessary for other games. In the narrative of the Beginner's Guide, these are simply projects that Coda has shared with Wreden. Maybe those 2 short games you were talking about were actually never finished. Maybe the games are purposefully dull because they haven't actually been completed yet.
I understand that, but like I said, these games require so little interaction and input that I feel like I could just watch somebody play the game in a YouTube video and get the same ideas out of it. The dialogue trees don't actually create any differences, and there's only one puzzle in the entire game, and it's used multiple times. I need something more than just walking around and looking at things.
But I think the game really hinges on that small amount of interactivity. Everything in the game builds up to the final level, where Coda leaves explicit messages for Davey detailing exactly why he hates him. Say we had just watched Davey playing these games, and then he showed us these revelations. Would that really mean anything to the player? As a viewer, rather than a player, I feel like I wouldn't be able to connect with Coda or Davey's emotional stakes in this game because I didn't experience them for myself. I needed to play these games to experience just how Wreden does corrupt them, to be able to actually connect with both Coda and Wreden as they share their ideas about these games.
But why does playing these games offer a more emotional connection than just watching them? Shouldn't we be affected the same way?
To me, actually being able to control the games allows me to explore the different levels, and shift my perspectives on them as well. I can go at my own pace to really think about just why each game might have been made, and as I go along, I'm linked with Wreden and his interpretations. Even though he controls the story as the narrator, I can also control the story with my actions. For example, in the jail cell, I can stay in there for an hour in defiance of Wreden opening it up for me. The narrator can't really show us what's in these games unless we physically move the avatar, which I think gives the player a lot more stake in the narrative itself and makes it much more emotional at the ending.
I get that, but I feel like the ultimate message of the game is somewhat convoluted. So Davey the narrator puts all his emotional energy into sharing these games with us, and ultimately finds out that at the end of the day, we can never really know someone through their work, and that the connection we feel with games, books, TV shows, and everything else doesn't really amount to anything.
I think that may be part of it. Since he is so obsessed with Coda, Davey the narrator doesn't really take stock of his own life. He doesn't step back and look at how unhealthy that relationship actually is. At one point, Davey says that sharing Coda's games makes him feel like he's worth something, but that's a lot of outside validation and taking credit for someone else's work. It might be him talking about how fans come to think of others' works as their own, like fandoms and all that stuff.
So what is he actually trying to say with this game? To me, it seems like he just made this story and these weird games to seem really cool and innovative, but there's really no payoff at the end. It feels empty and devoid of any substance.
But that's also part of the reason that it works so well. The game plays a lot with the idea of emptiness. A lot of the games within the beginner's guide have a lot of empty space in them. The tower, the epilogue, stairs, down, notes, Mobius, and a lot of other games all have a lot of extra space with nothing in them. In some of the games, the ceilings in the buildings are extremely high, or you're looking into outer space, and these games work to make the player feel really small.
But so what? Why does it matter? Aren't these games supposed to make us feel like we're useful and control our characters and actions? Don't we play these games to get away from the mundane of real life?
Well, a lot of other games use large landscapes to make the player feel exceptionally alone as well. Journey, Shadow of the Colossus, Xenoblade Chronicles, and almost any JRPG with a large world map use huge landscapes to give a feeling of scale. But while those games use emptiness to make the player feel like they're alone physically, the beginner's guide uses the space to make us feel alone emotionally. Rather than just being about fans, the game might be about how hard it is to truly know another person entirely.
Yes, thanks. I noticed that other games are big and empty, but that doesn't mean they're emotionally isolating. Davey talks a lot about how he shares his emotions with Coda during the game. Having writer's block, feeling unsure, sad, lonely. Sure, these landscapes are lonely, but Davey, Coda, and the player all seem to be able to connect emotionally on some level.
Yes, but is that actually a true connection? Take, for example, the game called This Game is Connected to the Internet. In that game, it tells you that you can leave notes wherever you want in the game, and the other notes that appear are placed by people playing it from the internet. But it turns out that all of the little thought bubbles left that were supposedly left by online players were all put there by Coda himself. So you have this whole huge area filled to the brim with player comments, only to find out that really only one guy exists within them, and that one man is imitating a lot of other people, so he's not even being his true self in that game. You observe all these snippets of dialogue, but they're really just words with no substance and no connection.
But if all these games are designed to make us feel lonely, why have Davey as a narrator? Wouldn't it be more effective to just have no dialogue? Well, you can play the game without narration. The default setting is still with the narrator, making that the version most users would play. If the game wants to show how hard it is to know someone, why include the narrator story arc at all, especially one that goes so in-depth with Davey's emotions?
Well, it depends how you look at it. Again, some people believe that Coda is actually a real game developer, which would mean that Davey Wreden's emotions during the game would be true to how he currently feels or felt at the time period that the game was made. However, I believe the game's not true or factual at all. I think Wreden made this game from scratch, just like the Stanley Parable. So the narrator Davey and all of his obsession and emotional development through the game doesn't actually apply to the real-life Davey Wreden. Like the notes left by Coda, the game is made up by Wreden, causing another wall to be put up between him and the player and the character he's portraying, making it impossible to truly know how he feels.
We might be going for that with his work. I wouldn't necessarily agree with him. We can share our emotions and our experiences with others by talking to them, and we can empathize with others as well. We can understand how other people feel because we might have been in the same situation as them before. We've all been happy, sad, etc. So I think this game might be a little bit too smug and self-serving to be a great narrative. Not to mention the extreme lack of interactivity and really anything to do in it. It just doesn't feel complete without good gameplay, or any gameplay for that matter.
That's true, but maybe he's just trying to argue that while we want to fully understand others, it can be really difficult. Books, TV shows, movies, letters, video games, and many other forms of communication can help us share our lives with other people, but if we choose to change these texts for our own desires, we're not truly communicating or listening to one another. True connection can be incredibly difficult, and maybe actually impossible to achieve, but the beginner's guide digs deep into that dilemma, and I think the lack of gameplay works well with the feeling of emotional emptiness. What I love most about the game is not the answers, but the questions.
So that's the Game Detective's debate on the beginner's guide. What do you think? Is it a masterpiece or an edgy Gary's Mod reject?
Let us know in the comments that I'm right.